Hello everyone, and once again thank you all for joining us for today's seminar on business travel threats. In particular, I'll be talking about the 6 main business travel threats for 2011. We'll get started shortly here. If I can just do a sound check and get a couple of you to update me in the chat box. Excellent, thank you very much. It appears that, yep, most people can hear me. That's good. Sometimes technology works, sometimes we have some challenges, so it's good that everyone can hear me. Brief introduction for those who don't know who I am. I'm a security professional. I've been working for over 20 years in the security field in a combination of commercial and government services. In particular, in the last several years, I've been working on travel safety and security. In particular, developing, designing and delivering intelligence, operations and consulting services in the travel safety and security space. Today's webinar, we're going to talk about the impending or the most probable travel safety and security threats for business travellers in 2011. In particular, what we're not going to be talking about, I won't be talking about a number of tactile issues. In particular, I find a lot of these sessions talk about which leadership and which particular threat groups and countries and specifics that, to be quite honest, really don't focus on the core issues associated with business travel threats. If we look at the most dominant issues that threaten business travel on a day-to-day by hour basis, particularly the bigger the volume, it boils down to issues such as delay, in particular disruptions. They make up the largest majority of all reportable and likely incidents to threaten the productivity, efficiency and even the safety of business travel. Therefore, they constitute significant threat. Therefore, I'll be talking about some of those issues as we go through today's session. Then as we start to go into some of the less likely or extraordinary but still quite plausible, particularly depending on the preparation and planning of individuals and organisations, we start to get lesser and lesser likelihood of these particular events taking place. And of course, 2010 in particular finished the year with quite a strong presence and activity in natural events, and 2011 has certainly set the landscape for some of the things that we may potentially be able to experience over the course of the next 12 to 18 months, but it reinforces the unpredictable nature when we're talking about natural events, but they also coincide and link to sizable delays and disruptions, not necessarily catastrophic as we've seen in the first quarter of 2011, but certainly they contribute significantly. So the thrust and the focus of today's session will be focused on these delay and disruption issues. Whilst terrorism, illness, accidents and a whole plethora of other minor events still affect business travellers on a day-to-day basis, the bulk of it is made up through delay and disruption type events. The focus of today's session is to focus on the main reasons we undertake business travel in the first place. Most agree that it's a competitive advantage. It's a profit-driven activity. Estimates suggest that for every dollar of business travel conducted, every single dollar generates approximately $15 US in terms of revenue. So the focus of today's session will be to identify and enhance organisations to increase their profitability associated with business travel, to make the overall business process more efficient and effective, and last but certainly not least, to enhance and maximise the safety umbrella or the safety concept for all business travellers and corporate providers. So that's specifically the objectives that we're going to be talking about, and certainly the areas most plausible and most likely affecting business travel. Now, when we talk about business travel, the reason it's centred on business travel is they tend to represent the top 5 to 10% in terms of the demographic of the organisation. They're often the highest paid, the biggest revenue generators, the senior leadership, the executive management, and therefore it's not necessarily we're talking about the entire HR spectrum within the organisation, but in particular we're talking about the high yield, high end human capital, people capital element. Now this is often distributed differently within organisations. A finance organisation, for example, may have currency traders, they may have experts, they may have economists and so on, but a consultancy company, for example, a much larger proportion of their organisation, sometimes upwards of 80 and 90% of their overall headcount, may be those high yield revenue earning individuals. So we're talking specifically about business travellers. Business, they may be executives, they may be management, they may even be interns, but they're business travellers for both international and domestic purposes. And as we go through the session, I'll be taking questions. You'll notice in the right-hand side of the webinar setup, you'll be able to pose questions as we go along throughout. So I'll address questions as we go along, or I'll cluster questions at the natural pause of each of these sections and address them as we go along. Feel free to add as we go out through the session. Don't necessarily need to wait until we come to the end. So, as I said earlier, 2010 certainly left a legacy in which we've inherited for 2011, but specifically I'll talk about the issues and the probability of the main events that are going to affect business travel and business travellers throughout the course of the next 12 to 18 months. First and foremost, we need to talk about airlines. Airlines play a pivotal role in all travel management and certainly travel risk containment strategies. First of all, the delays associated with airlines. Airlines themselves have been plagued by a number of issues associated with fuel costs, profitability, share coding, booking travels, the rise of the economic flyer, choice in the market, and a whole host of other issues that have impacted the airlines directly. Now, this has a flow-on effect for business travellers and business travel managers, not only from an administrative perspective, but delays can compound or enhance the threats associated with business travel, particularly if you're delayed and stuck in an area in which you're unfamiliar, you're unprepared, or even environments which are hostile by their very nature and you have a higher degree of exposure to particular threats and issues. So these delays associated with airlines, even though most people have accepted them as a routine part, if not mandatory process of business travel, will increase over the course of 2011 and certainly compound the issues associated to travel safety and security. Service levels of airlines, we all know firsthand, have been somewhat checkered. There are some airlines which still stand out as a beacon of service. However, many are shaving costs. Many are undergoing industrial action from their own personnel because they've outsourced health and safety servicing, or they're seeking to offshore a number of these jobs. So hand in glove, these particular issues in terms of service standards under the expectation of service and support of individuals associated with how the staff of their own airline view the services, essentially also compound the travel threat issues associated with 2011. We've already seen some very unfortunate instances where individuals have suffered in-flight emergencies, deep vein thrombosis, coronary issues, fits and so on, and the in-flight capability of the airlines has been certainly found wanting, and unfortunately some people have passed away. So all of these things in terms of the risk exposure of business travellers, particularly those who travel very frequently, the exposure to gamma rays, the threats of deep vein thrombosis, the proximity of people who are themselves unwell, the varying degree of hygiene and a whole host of other things is highly dependent on the service standards of the airlines. And if anything, it's the one most inconsistent element across all of the airlines and airline services is how they actually go about their business, particularly as we start to go into more exotic, more remote or further afield locations. The schedules themselves, many airlines as part of their cost sharing or cost efficiencies often code share their particular flight. So you may find at a very late stage, if you even discover it at all sometimes, that the flight or the airline that you've made your bookings on or you think you're flying upon simply isn't the parent airline. It's been subcontracted 2 or 3 or multiple times and you're simply on a code share for multiple airlines because of the efficiency of the airlines. Therefore, you're at the mercy of these schedules more often than not. So you may find yourself, whether it's premeditated or accidental, you may find yourself arriving and departing from foreign cities and foreign locations at various times of the day and night. And this is something you need to be prepared for, particularly with female travellers, departing or arrival late at night with limited connecting services, lack of preparation, lack of planning, in the middle of a public holiday, for example, or heightened particular events. All of these things compound the various issues associated with airlines. And in no small degree, we've seen issues around the GDS and the booking services where these systems have suffered catastrophic failure. And the airlines themselves have therefore not been able to check in or manage travellers. This has had a knock-on effect to both the airlines and the airports in particular, which then blocks the entire system. All it takes is it doesn't just take minor events. We've seen the volcano impacts that have occurred on more than one occasion, the no-fly and exclusion zones that are put in place because of trade sanctions or pending micro wars that are taking place. All of these issues add to the frustrations and threats associated with business travel. But these issues can quickly escalate or quickly compound and affect individuals or collective groups in a much wider area or much greater footprint than just a few reissuing of tickets. You may find yourself being forced into emergency accommodation that you're unfamiliar with. A number of corners may be cut, your initial threat or risk assessments undermined by these last-minute continuous delays, scheduling issues, and certainly service standards. These are all highly plausible and highly probable events that all organisations and certainly travel risk managers should be cognizant of and should be prepared for. In 2011, it's unlikely that these are going to be reduced in any shape or form, and given a number of contributing factors, as I mentioned earlier, it's likely to be one of the major sources of travel threat triggers throughout the course of 2011. I mentioned earlier in particular the array of choice. This is a feast or famine process. Many routes or many locations are enjoying the growth of budget or low-cost carriers. However, choice is not necessarily something contributing to the factor of sensible travel risk management. It may be a cost efficiency process, but it may amplify the overall associated risk of business travel, particularly when it comes into code sharing, when we've got service and schedules. Many of the bigger airlines are plagued by the top 3 delays and issues. When we start coming into some of the low-cost carriers and budget carriers, these issues are amplified tenfold or more, and it's something you need to be aware of. So airlines is one contributing factor. Airports themselves. Airports are plagued by the reality that they're often not conveniently located. That is, there's in almost all instances a commute required from the primary area of accommodation, of business, or even for travel, leisure and business activities. Airports are somewhat removed from the major economic hubs or business districts in which most people are travelling for. So the airports themselves constitute risk, and this risk over 2011 is going to be increased.